We begin with these new clashes over the Mueller hearings, now 1 week away as of tonight. For months, Trump and his attorney general claimed they were fine with Mueller testifying, and if he does, it wouldn't be a big deal. That bluster, though, is already giving way to some kind of palpable fear, including this new report that the Trump DOJ wants to silence Mueller's deputies from testifying at all, even in closed session. And now Trump's personal lawyer, Giuliani, joining Trump allies to blast these hearings before they begin.
A bunch of unethical, disgraceful prosecutors, which is what they are. And all this lionizing of Mueller is disgraceful. He was a hitman.
When it comes to Mr. Mueller's testimony, I think we've got a lot of questions about bias, about how he assembled his team. I think we also want to know why he flipped the expectation that Americans are innocent until proven guilty.
I think he's going to have a tough time Wednesday. It's not going to go the way the media thinks. Mr. Mayor, good to see you.
I doubt it. And, it'd be very interesting to see if he does another stumbling and bumbling.
Another stumbling and bumbling. Now, Rudy Giuliani himself has been criticized for bumbling legal presentations. Right there, he's opening a new line of attack on Mueller's demeanor. Others making vague aspersions about Mueller's team and their independence. And it's not just a PR battle. The story I just mentioned is important. Privately, Trump's DOJ has been now exposed for trying to derail the planned testimony from some of Mueller's deputies, trying to block two of them who have already agreed to speak with lawmakers behind closed doors. New York Times here reporting the DOJ has instructed these two men not to appear, and they don't even work at the DOJ anymore, which means they probably cannot be legally forced to stay quiet. But this reporting notes a chilling effect when the DOJ tells longtime employees to be quiet. Now, this story has not yet gotten a ton of attention, and there's, first of all, a lot going on, and second, this is playing out in secret lobbying, in private backroom D.C. skirmishes. Think about what it suggests tonight. There can be valid reasons to argue some officials should not testify in public hearings. Security concerns, classified material. And that's when there are debates about tackling topics in closed session. In fact, Bob Mueller himself has repeatedly told Congress he prefers to take on certain items in private session. That's something we found he said repeatedly in the 60 different congressional hearings he's done over his long career, which we scoured for clues on next week's hearing. But tonight we actually have something different. It's Donald Trump's handpicked attorney general trying to prevent testimony that is explicitly, carefully slated for this private session with the very members of Congress, like the Intelligence Committee, who have the highest clearance to handle secret information. If this sounds bad, that's because it looks bad. The DOJ trying to stop private testimony, raising questions 1 week out from these hearings. First, obviously, what are they afraid of? If these Mueller prosecutors, think about this, I'm just going to say it in English. These were the people that this same Justice Department trusted to handle the most sensitive evidence for years of this probe, to interrogate and arrest and lead to the imprisonment of people. They handled all of that. And now the same DOJ says they can't be trusted to talk to authorized members of our government? Suspicious. Now, the Trump administration isn't saying much about their angle here. If they had a public defense, I would, as I do, I would report it to you. And interestingly, the Democrats in Congress leading the hearings, they're not saying much either.
Have Mueller's deputies agreed to come and testify in closed session?
They have agreed to meet with our committee in closed session, and I'm not going to get into specifics.
May very well be his deputies.
And do you know how many of them it would be if it's going to be not Mueller but rather his deputies?
Probably one or two.
And which ones?
I'm not going to say the name.
I knew you weren't. I could tell, but I have to ask.
Now, those same committee chairs do say they're not going to be intimidated out of the plan.
Of course, the Attorney General, Bob Barr, does not want Mueller to testify. He doesn't want to be contradicted in his lies and misrepresentations.
I'm sure he would be thrilled if his misrepresentations were the last word, but we're determined to make sure that's not the case, and we look forward to Mr. Mueller's testimony.
So take it all together tonight, 1 week out. These Democratic chairmen, they sound pretty confident. The Trump administration sounds a little shook, now apparently afraid of even private testimony or Mueller talking about his report in public. So what is scary? What has them shook about the facts? What is scary about a 400-page pile of evidence? Bob Mueller already wrote the story of our political lifetime for all to see. To quote the late, great Prodigy, he put our lifetime between the paper's lines. Next week, some of those paper's lines may come to life on TV, whether that scares the Trump administration or not. I'm joined now by Jason Johnson, politics editor for The Root, criminal defense attorney Caroline Polisi, who represented guilty Trump aide George Papadopoulos and knows a thing or two about this probe, and former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner, who knows a thing or two about Bob Mueller, having worked directly for him, you see it right here, at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office. Great to have all of you here. Glenn, your view of the significance and implications of the attempt to get Mueller's deputies to shut up, to not speak even in a careful private setting next week.
You know, Ari, you ask, what are they afraid of? Because they've gone around crowing about how the Mueller report established no obstruction, no collusion. So why wouldn't they welcome the people who actually did the investigative work that generated the Mueller report coming in and testifying no obstruction, no collusion? Well, it's because they're afraid of the substance of the report, because as we know, in Volume 1, there was a finding of sweeping and systematic Russian interference and tons, and I'll say it one more time, tons of coordination between Trump campaign officials and Russia. That's a problem for the administration. And then second, there are some 10 or 11 instances of what can only be called obstruction of justice by President Trump, detailed in Volume 2.
11 incidents discussed. I would say 5 to 6 are under that higher bad level of substantial evidence, as according to Mueller. You may see more than him, but in terms of what the Mueller report says, let me read to you a little more on this clash, because again, I think it's very important. That's why it's our lead story, where you have the DOJ acting like they're cool. Oh yeah, do what you want, and then privately dropping the hammer. Reading from the Times reporting about these Mueller deputies, Zebley considered Mueller's closest associate, former chief of staff, functioned in a similar role in the special counsel's office. The other gentleman prosecutor here, Mr. James Quarles, worked as a Watergate prosecutor, heavily involved in the team's investigation into whether Trump's attempt to impede investigators constituted obstruction, and was the lead intermediary with the White House. What do you think those two prosecutors could lawfully say? Not leaking, grand jury material, anything they're not supposed to do, and we have no reason to think these lawyers want to break the law. What could they lawfully say in closed session that would matter?
They can lawfully talk about each instance where the president was found to have done something that probably constitutes a high crime and misdemeanor. You see Giuliani and Barr trying to bully witnesses that they have no legal right to block. Now, they can bully Hope Hicks into making a fictitious claim of absolute immunity, a claim that when it was last taken up in court in 2008 by Judge John Bates, albeit, and it was a George W. Bush issue at that point, because it was White House counsel Harriet Miers invoking it. Judge John Bates, a George W. Bush appointee, said it's nonsense. It doesn't exist. So they can try to use fictitious invocations of privilege to stop the Hope Hicks and maybe even the Don McGahns. But now, Ari, as you say, they're desperate because they can't stop these private citizens from coming in and talking about the substance of the report. And you know what? They don't have to put any bells and whistles on it. If they talk only about what we see in those 448 pages, that's going to be a great start in exposing what the administration has done.
Turning to some of my experts right here in New York, Jason, how do you think it looks?
Well, the key is they're more concerned about these private sessions than they are with Mueller, right? Because Mueller has already said, I'm not going to say anything beyond the report. I'm not going to get, and it's frustrating because I think that has allowed this administration to be as aggressive. Mueller's great till he's got to be great, right? When he's got to be great in front of everybody, he's like, well, I'm not going to say anything besides the report. And he shouldn't be afraid to express and possibly expound upon the truth that he presented in the Mueller report. And that's what's making the administration feel like, well, if we can shut them up behind closed door and Mueller's not going to say anything, we can just PR this to death and we can get out of it.
Yeah, if you know anything about Bob Mueller, as you did extensive research here on The Beat, we knew from the beginning of this that he wasn't going to go outside the four corners of those pages. But luckily, there are 448 of those pages, and as you have rightly noted, not many of which people have actually read. So I know there was sort of this collective letdown when we heard from Mueller in May that he wasn't going to, that he didn't actually want to talk to the public about it. Even if, Ari, he sticks to those 448 pages, there's so much in there. It's the difference between reading the book and watching the movie. Right. It's going to have an effect regardless of whether or not we get any new information outside of that report.
And you know a bit, what do you know about Zebli and Quarles and the rest of that team when you see Giuliani say, oh, they're all super biased, they're terrible? What's going on behind the scenes here based on your dealings with the team?
I don't know about them specifically. I can say in terms of my dealings with congressional committees, it is, it's a bureaucracy. So I can see how these things take time. And I would be surprised if it were Bob Mueller himself that's emailing with, the committee. So there are layers upon layers of negotiations.
Do you think, I mean, you dealt with this and you've had your differences with them because, as I mentioned, you represented a former Trump advisor. But do you think it is reasonable for them to go in and talk in closed session? Or do you?
Absolutely.
So, so what do you think DOJ is up to?
Well, I don't see DOJ actually putting forth any real legal arguments for any reasons why they shouldn't be doing it. I think they would prefer they not do it.
Is this the Justice Department version of fake news? It's a fake argument?
I don't think it's a real legal argument, and which is why we don't have anything, on paper from them.
No, if we did, I would quote it.
Exactly.
Right.
So I don't see them pushing this beyond just we would prefer you not do it. I don't see them.
So you think they're rattling the cage a little?
Potentially. I mean, look. There are reasons they wouldn't want them to talk, obviously, but there's nothing really legal there.
And they're also kind of working the refs here. Because, look, at the end of the day, you're telling private citizens, don't listen to Congress. Don't respond to subpoenas. And that is a larger problem that we've seen with this administration, that they basically ignore the law whenever it's something that they don't like. So they figure if they can make enough noise, maybe they'll make either of these testimonies, maybe they'll make them nervous, maybe they'll make the Democrats nervous. None of that is going to happen because at the end of the day, these are private citizens and they want to talk.
And that brings us to the Bill Barr of it all, Glenn. I don't know, when you were at DOJ, did it have as much trolling? Because Bill Barr loves to troll. You're familiar with that internet term?
It didn't have any trolling.
No trolling. So here's a guy, and again, I've said this before on my show, and I'll say it again. No one is accusing Bill Barr of breaking a law. It is not, at this point, something at that level. But he very clearly hijacked a very serious legal process to make a spectacle of his version of events to override the serious independent investigation that occurred. A lot of people are critical of that, including people that were formerly quite supportive of his credentials. And here is Bill Barr. That's why I say it's a troll. Here is Bill Barr, Mr. 4-page summary, out there taking a shot, a little, neck shot at Mueller before this thing starts, accusing him and the Congress of making the spectacle, which is very trolly. Take a look.
I don't think that serves any purpose dragging Bob Mueller up if he, in fact, is going to stick to the report. It seems to me the only reason for doing that is to create some kind of public spectacle.
Glenn, is that right?
Yeah, well, this is the same Bill Barr who said maybe a month ago, I have no problem with Bob Mueller coming in and testifying about his investigation, his findings, and his conclusions. So Barr is becoming about as consistent as Donald Trump. Barr is also the person that in one breath says, I'm going to recuse from an investigation, and then turns around and says, nah, just kidding, I'm not going to recuse. So, he really is becoming less and less credible and reliable. And, he's doing harm to the department. And I think he's an embarrassment to the people that are working for him.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.